I want to get started with the story about the wealth transfer. 6 years ago, there was a report on Fox Business which actually claimed that the wealth from boomers was going to transfer over to millennials and to the Gen Z generation, and that it was going to be huge. There are new reports that dispute that. But first, let's take a step back into time. 6 years ago, when Fox Business made that claim. Let's dive right in.
Welcome back. Trading Places, the largest generational transfer of wealth is coming as baby boomers move out of the workforce and millennials move in. The shakeup is estimated to cause a transfer of $30 trillion over the next 30 to 40 years. This is according to a new report by the Wells Fargo Investment Institute. And joining us right now to talk more about it is Wells Fargo Investment Institute Global Quantitative and Technical Strategist, Samir Samana. Samir, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
This is a big story.
So let's pause here and then I'll continue. Notice who their source is. Wells Fargo, a bank. You know, I would have thought even 6 years ago when this was covered, I would have thought after 2008, after 2008, we had all learned not to trust the banks. But that's their source. That is important. Listen to what they say.
Baby boomers generally considered the wealth holding generation. Walk us through what's taking place.
Sure. So what we'll see over the next decade or so is we'll see about a 4 to 5% transfer every year. And then after that 10 years, what we'll see is an increase, almost to 8 to 9%. And so what you're seeing is the silent generation, which grew up during the Great Depression. They're passing on and, their wealth to the baby boomers, who will then turn around and pass on to the millennials. And so that's what will drive a lot of preference, a lot of consumption, and a lot of investing trends.
Do you think this is going to change and impact the economy as baby boomers retire, millennials take on more exposure in the workplace?
It will.
What's the impact to the economy?
Sure. So, what it'll do is it'll keep driving a lot of the trends that we've already seen, right? Technology will continue to be a much bigger portion of, how we do things, whether it's purchasing things online, whether it's, doing things, from an investing standpoint, like robo is a big deal right now. Wells Fargo just rolled out their own solution. Because again, what millennials are telling us is they'd rather have less interaction and they'd have things more automated.
Right. And talk a little bit about the fact that a lot of millennials are saving cash more than they're necessarily investing. So as you see this gradual transfer, how is that going to affect markets? And are there any in particular, investments, even though they're more rare, are there any investments that you see that millennials are leaning towards more?
Let's pause there for just a second. I want to point out something that he said. So in this segment 6 years ago, they said that boomers were retiring, right? And they said that they were opening up those positions in the workforce. So here's the problem that I've noticed, and you guys can tell me from your own perspective as well. I've noticed some of these boomers are not retiring. My parents didn't retire when they were eligible to fully retire. My dad, he retired from the military, but then he also went on to work for the United States Postal Service. So this is something we got to think about. Even when he was eligible to retire for the United States Postal Service, he continued working. The reality is a lot of the people that I've come across, particularly in the Boston area, that are at retirement age, guess what, folks? They're still working. When I worked at MIT, one of my coworkers, when she was eligible for retirement, she decided to continue working because of Social Security. So she worked until she was 70, so she would get more Social Security when she would retire. So this prediction that was made by Fox News, Fox Business 6 years ago, that all of these boomers were going to retire and clear up all this space in the workforce, that actually did not happen. And I'm going to explain to you what's happening instead. Let's continue a little bit more here.
That's a great point. So younger generations, what we're finding out is they have a little bit more in equities, but not nearly are they taking as much risk as they should be, and they hold a lot more cash. And we think that has to do with, having lived through the great financial crisis now. And if you're a Gen Xer, right, you went through the twin crises of the tech bubble and then the tech wreck and then the great financial crisis. So they hold a lot more cash. So one of the things we might, see as that wealth transfer takes place is they may not buy stocks to the same extent that they should.
Samir, one of the concerns is you have all these baby boomers retiring with these financial assets, and that they take it out of the market because they want to live on it and they have to use it to pay medical expenses and such, so that you have a huge sucking sound basically coming out of the stock markets over the next decade, 2 decades. Is that a problem that could hold back stocks over the next 10 or 20 years?
We don't think so. We'd be much more concerned if the millennials weren't as big a portion of the overall population as they are, right? I mean, they are almost as large in number as the baby boomers are. So they'll really kind of pick up the baton where the baby boomers leave off. Now, it has major sector implications. You know, healthcare is a great, point. When we were running the report and you look at how much the baby boomers are spending on healthcare, that's going to be a major trend for years to come. So for everybody who worries about, things like drug pricing, you're kind of missing the secular trend.
Are you saying that the baby boomers are...
We're going to pause there. Think about what he just said. He brought up the issue of health care. Now, that piece that he mentioned, I'm going to show you tonight, that actually was true. That prediction is true. The issue with health care, we'll get into that. But he also said that millennials were going to pick up the baton where the boomers left off. And we were just going to dive right in there and carry the mantle. I say me because I'm a millennial myself. That didn't happen. That did not happen. And I want to explain to you why. This idea that there was supposed to be this huge wealth transfer from boomers to millennials and Gen Z actually was a myth. And this is the reason why. And shout out to Roger Meadows for sending me this article. The wealth transfer from boomers won't save Gen X and millennials. Gen X, sorry, I think I said Gen Z previously. Experts say baby boomers will give more than 50 trillion to their heirs, but for many, healthcare costs will claim the bulk of that wealth. Let's continue on. The story goes that baby boomers are going to give tens of trillions of dollars to their heirs over the next few decades. The generational wealth transfer has become a media fascination, both for its eye-popping size and because it might help younger generations as they face doubts about their financial security. That shift is already in the works and will continue for a couple of decades. According to wealth management firm Cerulli Associates, some 53 trillion will be passed down from boomers to their Gen X, millennial, and Gen Z heirs, as well as to charities. That includes both gifts during their lifetimes and inheritance afterwards. But the overwhelming costs of healthcare for older people means most people in those latter generations won't inherit much, even if their elders seem well off today. So what they are pointing out in this article is that because of the rising cost of healthcare, most of these boomers that they said were going to pass down all this wealth won't have it to pass down. This is also part of the reason why more people are working longer. They're working past retirement age, not necessarily because they want to, but more so because they have to, because their retirement is not enough to cover expenses, the rising cost of living in this country, and also, of course, healthcare expenses. The bulk of trillions will go from one group already wealthy people to another. Cerulli estimated that 68% of the wealth transferred between 2020 and 2045, which includes boomers as well as older generations, will come from U.S. households with at least 1 million in investable assets. And only 6.9% of households have that kind of wealth to begin with. That might be obvious, but the notion still raises the prospect of large numbers of people getting a life-changing amount of money, a last gift from a parent or grandparent that meaningfully alters their circumstances. So a couple of years ago, people would say that they inherited a house from their parents or their grandparents. This is starting to change. partially because you have people that are part of this generation. Number one, that they may not have any property to pass down to anyone, or two, some of those people, some of those boomers actually have taken out second mortgages on their homes. Again, they still don't have anything else to pass down. So things have changed. You got to ask yourself this question, guys. And when we talk about capitalism in this country, you got to ask yourself this question. Why do you think it has become the norm to walk into a super Walmart and to see greeters at the door? And most of the time, it's people past retirement age. I can go to the gas station right down the street. There's a woman that works there that is past retirement age, standing on her feet for long hours. Why is that? You think she just wants to work? No, she has to. Because we've gotten to a point in this country where for a lot of people, especially those that are part of the working class, their retirement isn't enough to take care of them for the rest of their life anymore. So people are working longer. Listen to this. Collectively, baby boomers benefited a great deal from America's economic growth over the second half of the 20th century. The economy boomed in their childhoods as the U.S. became a superpower. And as adults, they had an easier time buying low-cost housing than their children or grandchildren would. Those who bought homes benefited as those properties increased in value. They've had the most time to benefit from U.S. stock market, which has soared roughly 4,000% since 1969. Now let's talk about the housing cost and home ownership. When my grandparents were growing up, my grandparents told me that when they were growing up, you could have a working class job, a blue collar job, and buy a house. It's hard to do that today. They didn't have to go to college to be able to afford a home. Things have changed. My parents did not go to college and they didn't have to, but they were still able to afford a home. When you look at the market, percent change in the S&P 500 since January 1980, $1,000 invested 43 years ago would be worth more than $41,000 today. So you see the change there? Feeling they're falling behind. Members of Gen X and millennial cohorts have had to contend with headwinds on multiple fronts. Among them, the explosion of student debt, the rising cost of living, the dot-com bust, the Great Recession, the long but sluggish boom of the 2010s, and the pandemic at more vulnerable stages of their lives and careers. So the younger generations might feel they could use a leg up. According to a 2023 survey by the Transamerica Center for Retirement Studies, Gen Xers reported having a median of $82,000 in retirement savings. Let me pause right there. How many of you have $82,000 for retirement savings? Because I don't. While millennials reported having $49,000 in savings. How many of you have $49,000 in savings? Even with many working years ahead of them, some have doubts about their ability to retire with financial security. According to Fidelity's annual retiree healthcare cost estimate, a single 65-year-old could need about $157,000 after taxes to cover their health care expenses in retirement, and a couple could need $315,000. Now, they're bringing up again the issue of health care. Now, of course, once you're 65, you get Medicare, but you still have that 20%, right? That you have to cover. This is where their money tends to go. It's one thing if you have a doctor's visit. It's another thing if you have to have a surgery. It's another thing if you're on prescription medication that is very expensive. This is what they're paying for. Guys, what has happened to this country? What has happened here? It should not be acceptable that someone who was 70 years old, 75 years old, hell, even 80 years old still has to work after you spent most of your life working, and retirement isn't enough and Social Security isn't enough. There was a conversation on Tim Pool's podcast called Millennials Are Completely Broke. I want to play part of this. This is something that I want you to hear that people may not have thought about. All the things we had to deal with, my generation had to deal with economically in this country. I want you to think about this for just a second. And I want to again stress to you that this idea of this massive wealth transfer that's being passed down to Gen X and millennials, it's a myth. It's a myth. Listen to this guy on Tim Pool's podcast. Listen to what he says. I think this is very important.
You basically got out of high school, 9/11 happens. We've been at war ever since you've been anything like an adult, right? And the only politics that you've known is people screaming at each other, calling each other Nazis and so forth. And that's it. That's our politics as far as since you've ever been paying attention to politics. That's what it's been. You just get out of college, and like the year or two after you get out of college, the financial crisis hits. And things are just a waste for several years. You finally start to maybe get back on your feet in your mid-30s and you're starting to put something together. COVID hits. Like, this is just an incredible amount of instability for any generation to handle. And, you know, the millennials are going to be the first generation in American history that has a lower standard of living than their parents do.
Yep. You hear that? So the reason why, again, what he said there is very important. It's just been one catastrophe after another. Like, literally, I'm trying to remember since when I became an adult, right? Like, there was stability. And I'm having a difficult time. Maybe you guys can help me. But you go from one thing to another. You go from September 11. You go into, you know, the dot-com crash. You go into the housing disaster, 2008, the housing crash. You have the pandemic. It's been one thing after another. Now, I wasn't alive, obviously, during the Great Depression. But it's almost like if you add all those things up together, it's like the Great Depression times 10. I don't remember economic stability during my adult life. I just don't.
And you cannot overstate, I think, how significant that is, right? Because it's not just that, like, oh, my parents had a house that was this big and I only get a house that's this big. What people relate it to, like what their basic standard of what a life should look like, is how things were when they were growing up. And so you have an entire generation of people who in the aggregate grew up a certain way and are starting to realize and understand that they are going to take a step back from where that was. And that's, you know, it's not some like huge mystery why we get Bernie Sanders at a time like this.
There's this viral video about pod housing where people, these companies will buy like a decently large loft and then stack up like 5 little cubes and then 5 on top. And you crawl into this little, it's probably 4 feet wide, 4 feet high. And you crawl into your little mat on the floor with your TV and your art, and that's your pod. Everyone shares the kitchen and bathrooms. And there's videos of these millennials being like, it's just so awesome. It's only $800 per month. And it's just like, oh no,
That's
for real.
so much.
You want to live in some of these cities, man.
Like, it's only $4 a month with a roommate.
Hey, this is what you're gonna get communism. You're gonna get little hippie houses, buildings where there's gonna be like 50 millennials all living in it, and they're sharing their kids. Like their kids are gonna be just communal kids. I mean,
Let me comment about that part that he said there. It's almost like, imagine if 100 people got together. Let's say 100 of us got together. Now, everybody would have to follow through with this commitment. Okay? Can't have people like ducking out the last minute and be like, psych, I'm out. If 100 of us got together and let's say each of us put in, you know, whatever money that we had, And let's say we decided to start our own standard of living. Let's say we move to a town in the United States that's pretty much vacant and nobody really wants to live there. One of those forgotten about towns. And let's just say we settled there. We put all our money together and we say, you know what? We are going to help ourselves because this economy is not working. And our standard of living is not getting better in this country unless you're pretty wealthy. What if we did that? Why don't more people do that? And I don't even want to hear the whole thing of, oh, that's communism, da da da. The root word from communism is community. What's wrong with community? So my thing is, why aren't more people doing that? And I continue to see all of these young people spend $2,000, $3,000 a month for apartments that are like shoe boxes, having 3 roommates. Why are we doing this? Why? Part of the problem is because a lot of the jobs are concentrated in the cities. You see, this is how they continue to get people to move into the cities, because the thing is, especially here in Massachusetts, most of the jobs are in Boston. Worcester's probably second. So if you don't want a long commute, it's like you live in the city, so you won't have a long commute, right? But the cost of living is so high. So it's either you live outside the city, have a long commute, and have a decrease in your standard of living, because let's be real, I know people that commuted 2 hours to work when I worked at MIT. Or you get some of your day back, but you pay more and live in the city. What if some of these companies that are concentrated in these cities like Boston, New York, San Francisco, what if some of those companies actually decided to set up locations in a podunk town that nobody's really thinking about? You notice they don't do that. Part of the reason why you have a lot of people, a lot of tech jobs and a lot of the tech degrees and all that kind of stuff, these tech companies, the reason why they're concentrated in cities like Boston, New York, Silicon Valley area, San Francisco, is because a lot of the colleges that provide degrees in that area and that are pretty renowned or elite exist in those areas. So the companies are basically following the colleges around. You know, I don't see a Google in the middle of nowhere, America. I don't see a Facebook location in the middle of nowhere, America. No, they're concentrated in the cities. This is a huge country. Why is everyone bunched up in these little locations, squeezed in together, densely populated? Why are we doing that? Things have to change. But I wanted to show this to you tonight because I wanted to debunk that myth that there's this large wealth transfer that is coming. They reported that 6 years ago and they were wrong, because the cost of living is continuing to increase, and also the health care issue. So you still have seniors that are rationing their meds till this day. You still have it. Now, I want to highlight this comment here. Robert said, my grandmother went pale when she found out her meds were more than $4,000. See, people think that once you qualify for Medicare, that you're set. Everything's going to be covered. No. You still have expenses. These are the things, guys. But the reality is, there is no large transfer of wealth that is coming to other generations. Honestly, you're on your own. And I'm just going to keep it real for you. You're on your own. And I think a lot of people, a lot of millennials have started to figure this out. Gen Xers are probably like, dude, we were trying to tell you guys. I think more people are starting to figure this out. So it's kind of like whatever wealth that you thought was coming your way, you're starting all over. You have to build it for yourself. That's where we are now. Gonna go to some of the comments here. Let me switch this up. Thank you for the super chat, Robert. Asset managers are reaping the wealth transfer through elderly care, medical, and housing costs, using retirement funds to privatize basic needs. Well said, Robert. Trimble says, totally right. They keep working until 80 years old, and then their job gets reclassified to a lower wage with lower benefits, etc. And I'll tell you something else too. Did you guys know when the housing crash happened in 2008, that's another thing that messed up the workforce, because all of a sudden people that were eligible to retire decided to hold on to those positions because they didn't know what was going to happen with the economy. That actually hurt things for people trying to come in and get those entry level positions. All of a sudden now the entry level positions were going to people that were part of the Gen X generation. So for those of us that were millennials and we were trying to come in to get those entry level positions, all of a sudden the job requirement was 3 to 5 years of experience. But it wasn't that requirement when the generation before us got those jobs. Ellen says millennials are struggling and don't have a fraction of the wealth that boomers had. Boomers benefited from affordable housing, pensions, favorable wages, and a lower cost of living. I don't know anyone in my generation that has a pension. Don't even know. Thank you, Eric. Plenty of other teachers are retirement age and simply cannot afford to retire, or else the teacher shortage would be much worse. And thank you, Aspen Fallen. My company does that. 3 million plus year revenue in a small lakeside Minnesota town of 10,000 peeps. Keeps our expenses down and profit sharing up. Small communities rock. Shout out to your company, Aspen Fallen. And thank you, Marcus. We should use stuff like Twitter Spaces plus shows like yours to plan common actions, spread ideas, and organize on a large scale. Yes, I've tried to do this on Twitter. Twitter's tough because there are some feds. I'll just keep it real. Some ops. There are some people who they join and they try to be a part of this. Doesn't work out. Last year, we actually had an event called Camp Data. We actually had a bunch of activists. We camped in New York to come up with different ideas and actually like share ideas with each other about how we can organize and build community. And come to find out, there was some ops a part of that too. You know, there's always infiltrators, but to what you were saying, great idea.